All right, folks, the Heaven Will Protect Viewer's Guide, pages 1 through 3. Page 1. Who were Ida and Angelica? They were young. They came thousands of miles to live in a great city. They were poor and worked to support their families. They faced discrimination and struggled against injustice. And they liked to go out dancing. Who were Ida and Angelica? Let me make this a little bit bigger. They were among the millions of immigrants who flooded U.S. cities in the early 20th century. Jewish and Italian in origin, they helped create a new urban youth culture. So they were part of the second wave of immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe. Struggling to overcome ethnic division, these young women joined a strike, the Uprising of the 20,000, that challenged the way others saw them and the way they saw themselves. Turn of the century immigration is often recalled through the golden glow of nostalgia. Everyone was good, families always pulled together, and new immigrants were welcomed to America. But such a view leaves out the rough spots, the crime, the conflict, the prejudice, and simplifies many other aspects of the immigrant experience. The workplace was not the only battleground for young immigrants like Ida and Angelica. They were also caught in a generational conflict between them and their parents. They were torn between the needs of their families and the attractions of an unfolding, industrialized urban youth culture, including dance halls and moving picture shows, which we call movies. This is when the first movies began to emerge, right? They cost a nickel, hence they were called Nickelodeons. Ida and Angelica are composite characters based on the lives of real women. Looking at their lives and experiences in the 1909 strike, Heaven Will Protect the Working Girl explores how young immigrants worked and played in the turn of the century city. So Ida and Angelica basically created the teen culture that you now live in. Okay, they were the first to go out unchaperoned by parents and have fun. All right, page 2. Who makes history? By 1900, America's industrial growth had transformed the U.S. into a world power. The nation's wealth and population were growing rapidly, yet poverty, corruption, and economic instability were widespread. Responding to these problems, Americans created a new and more active form of government that would shape American life for the next 100 years. The importance of reform efforts in this period has led historians to call it the Progressive Era. History texts often focus on presidents and exceptional individuals who sought to clean up the cities and modernize government. Immigrants are usually shown only as passive recipients of, or even obstacles to, reform and change. All right, but we're going to inject some agency into them. But recent research suggests that immigrants also played an active role in reform campaigns. There's that agency. Examining oral histories, census documents, foreign language newspapers, scholars have uncovered immigrants' own efforts to create a society that could provide new independence, equality, and opportunity. Seeking to improve their own lives, immigrant women like Ida and Angelica made alliances with progressive reformers and suffragists, and they joined trade unions, as you will see in the film. Struggling to bring about change, they became part of a diverse and turbulent social movement that transformed their own lives and those of millions of other Americans. The world they came from. Many of the millions of immigrants arriving in the U.S. in the early 20th century came from Italy and Eastern Europe, right? So the second wave came from Southern Europe and Eastern Europe into the Russian Empire. All right, so Russian Jewish would be another big ethnicity that would arrive here. Italian families had worked together on the land for centuries. For the most part, fathers ruled the household and mothers and children obeyed. Formal education was minimal, as all children had to help in the fields. Girls also did sewing, spinning, and cooking. Italian elites in the industrial north of Italy scorned the less educated and darker-skinned peasants of the underdeveloped south. So most of the immigrants came from southern Italy. In Eastern Europe, Christian majorities pushed Jews to the fringes of society, so anti-Semitism was there. Most Jewish men were artisans, they had skills. Some were religious scholars whose work was considered of utmost value, as was education. Like Italian women, Jewish women managed the household. Jewish mothers and daughters also worked as merchants, taking part in the market life of bustling but ghettoized communities in Eastern Europe. Economic and political changes undercut these pre-industrial cultures. So they were not accustomed to working in factories. In Italy, an agricultural depression uprooted thousands of peasants, who then sought a better life in the U.S. This is interesting. At first, 8 out of 10 Italian immigrants were men who came to the U.S. without families, and more than half of them went back. Economic turmoil in Eastern Europe, coupled with brutal repression, prompted a mass exodus of Jews to America. Many Jews were killed in pogroms in Russia, which were state-sanctioned massacres. Job and residential restrictions forced others to leave. Daughters often emigrated first, finding jobs and paying the passage for other family members. Okay, so this is a picture of a family, immigrant family, reaching Ellis Island. So the immigration depot on the East Coast, the largest one would have been Ellis Island, which is an island right off of Manhattan. It was an island that had always been there, but New York City made it larger when they began building the subways and used the dirt from the subways to make Ellis Island larger. And they eventually built a hospital. The immigration depot on the West Coast, the largest one was the Golden Gate, out by San Francisco. But Ellis Island would have had, kind of like an immigration depot like you see here. Okay, the boat, there would be a first class, a second class, and a steerage class arriving over or traveling over here on a boat. All right, first and second class travelers did not need to be inspected when they got here. The presumption was if you were able to afford a first or a second class ticket, then you were trustworthy enough. You were able to take care of yourself and your family, so on and so forth. You were smart enough, so on and so forth. So only those in the steerage class had to be inspected. All right. So they would arrive at Ellis Island, and the island, the building would be broken up into different ethnicities or languages. So you would get online based upon what language you spoke. All right. And as soon as you got off the boat, they would inspect you medically. They would flip your eyelids over to see if you had a very contagious eye disease that out of Europe. All right. Not wanting it to spread in the United States. And then they would ask you, and again, this varied at times. Was not always it was not always the same exact process. It depended upon who was president. If the president was more anti-immigration, he would choose a superintendent, or his Secretary of the Interior would choose a superintendent that was more anti-immigration and make the inspection process more difficult. If the president happened to be more for open immigration, then the process would be easier. But by and large, you'd be inspected medically. If you were found to have a contagious disease, you were sent back. All right. And if you were not found to have a contagious disease, you proceeded to the next stop in the line. If you had a sickness that would heal, very often you were put into the adjacent hospital until, in fact, you did heal. All right. In fact, over 90% of the immigrants that did go or did arrive at Ellis Island were admitted to the United States. All right. So while the inspection process was pretty invasive and the traveling itself in steerage, which means kind of like on the bottom of the boat, so to speak, the worst conditions on the boat. The trip itself was pretty harrowing. The inspection was pretty invasive and demeaning. Nevertheless, over 90% still got in. All right. At times, they would test your political leanings. They would ask questions about your politics. Were you radical? Were you a Marxist? Things like that. And they also at times would test your IQ. All right. A lot of times they would have like a wooden jigsaw puzzle of the silhouette of a human being from the shoulders up, and it would be like maybe 10, 12 pieces, and you would have to put it together in about 30 or 60 seconds, whatever it was. All right. And if you were deemed not smart enough, you would not be allowed into the country. This is actually where the terms idiot, moron, and imbecile come from. They were clinical psychological terms that were used to refer to people, adults who had the mind of a child. And they came out of this testing process, this inspection process at Ellis Island. All right. Now, if you were sent back, you wouldn't have the money to pay for it yourself. I mean, for the most part, if you were being inspected, it meant you traveled there in steerage, and for the most part, you probably spent all or almost all of your savings everything you had on the trip. So the trip back would be on the owners of the boat, right? They would be the ones paying for it essentially. So you also would have been inspected over in Europe, all right? Because they wouldn't want to have to pay to bring you back, all right? Um, so Ellis Island pretty much became the immigration depot on the East Coast up until 1924. As you will learn later in the unit, all right, the United States turns off immigration in 1924 for everybody but the English, Germans, and somewhat the Irish. All right, but everybody else, it was a quota system. You were allowed a certain small number of Italians or Spanish or whatever um, into the country, and it was a monthly quota. So what you would see is midnight, right before the first day of the month, you would see all these boats in the harbor right outside Ellis Island, and they would zoom to Ellis Island right when it struck midnight, and the quota would be filled that night, basically. Um, and at that point, we also put the inspection process. We then would begin to have offices in different nations where we would inspect immigrants before they would even leave. And today we call that like getting a visa. All right, the inspection process happens in your home country before you even travel here. All right, so that's pages 1 through 3.